CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. Cascading refers to the CSS hierarchy, or being able to override previously declared styles. We'll get more into that when we get into the specificity video. Style sheets are just a place to define how a website should look. We separate content from styling so we can always have a consistent experience across an application or website, regardless of the content on the page. This separation is done using CSS and HTML. So if our styling is separate from our content, we need to be able to define styles and have them targeted at specific parts of the content. We do this using selectors. This is a CSS rule set. It is made up of a selector and a series of rules or style definitions in braces. All of these selectors correspond to something in the markup to define what element gets which rules applied to them. This is an element selector. There's no special syntax. Just use any stylable DOM element name and it will style all of those elements. In this example, the selector would apply to all list items regardless of where they are in the page. The selector is great for styling existing semantic elements. This is a class selector. It is specified using a period in front of the class name. In this example, this selector applies to any element that has a class attribute which is set to important. Classes can be used on as many elements on a page as needed. They are also not tied to a specific element type. So if we needed to change a button to a link, it wouldn't affect this styling. When we get into best practices, we'll talk more about this, but we'll be using classes a lot. This is an ID selector. It is specified using a pound or hashtag symbol. It corresponds to the ID property in the DOM. ID is very similar to class. The main difference is an ID should only be used once per page. When we talk about best practices, we'll get into this more, but it is recommended to avoid using IDs with CSS selectors. A lesser used selector is the attribute selector. Using the brackets, we can target elements with specific attributes and values. If you just use the attribute name, it applies regardless of the value. But, as in this example, we can target specific values as well. They can be more complex using syntax that is similar to regular expressions to target specific value patterns. But this can make your selectors hard to read and edit, so it's not recommended. Also, many of the most valuable attributes have already been made into pseudo classes. The majority of the time, all you need are basic selectors, like the class and element selectors. But there are times when more advanced selectors will save you from adding unnecessary HTML or JavaScript to accomplish the styling and interaction you need. And the most basic or common example of interactive styling are state pseudo classes on links. And they're called pseudo classes because you don't define anything specifically in the DOM to make them work. So here in the HTML, we have an unordered list with some links, a button, and the last one looks like a link because it's also an A tag, but it's actually a named anchor because it doesn't have an href or a URL that it's going to. Let's go ahead and style some of these links. So if I want to remove the underlines from all of the links, I can do that by targeting the A and changing the text decoration to none. If I want to change just the links, notice that they're blue but the last one isn't. I can do that using the link pseudo class. I can target the links and then change the color of the text to be green. Now, one of these is purple because it is a link that I visited. If I want to change the visited state, I can go ahead and use the visited pseudo class, and then I can change the color to something like orange. I can add a hover state to the links by using the hover pseudo class. Here I'll add the underline back when we hover over the links using text decoration. And notice the last A tag also gets this hover state, even though it isn't a link. So to be more specific, we can stack the link and hover pseudo classes, or even use the href attribute selector to just target tags with an href property. Links also have an active state, which is triggered when the link is being activated, or in this example, when the mouse is being held down while hovering over the link. Here I'm going to go ahead and change the border, give it 1 pixel and make it solid. And so when I hover over it and I click the button, you can see that border shows up. It's important to know that order matters here. CSS is designed to have a hierarchy, and you can override these states or pseudo classes if things get out of order, and they'll do things that you may not expect. So it's recommended if you're going to use any of these pseudo classes to use link, visited, hover, active in that order. Now, links aren't the only elements with these pseudo classes. If I make a generic hover pseudo class and add a green border to it, it'll trigger on all the elements on the page. So I can be more specific by adding the A tag to the front of it. but that also triggers that named anchor. So I can add the href attribute selector, or in this case, I'll stack it with the link selector. And then if I want to also include the button in the same hover state, I can use a comma to combine selectors in the same rule set. So none of these pseudo classes were defined by us by changing the DOM, but they come from the browser and the user's interactions. There are also some form pseudo classes, but these link pseudo classes are the ones that are most commonly used when you're styling a website. There are a set of state pseudo classes that are designed to work with form elements and interactions. Similar to link pseudo classes, these add some interaction without adding any JavaScript and are not explicitly declared in the DOM. So let's take a look at the markup. I have a form with some field sets to group things together. I've got some labels, and this is an input of type email. This one is of type text. It has a pattern on it to actually validate the value as the user types it in. And this has a required attribute. This field set for city is disabled, so I can't actually put my cursor in there. I can't give it focus. And this field set is just a radio group. Now let's add some styles. I'm going to start with the field set because it is ugly. I'm going to start by removing the border and the margin. And I'm going to add some padding just to make it easier to read. Now all of the text inputs have different types, and so I added a text class to all of them. I'm going to use that to change the border color a little bit. When these inputs have focus, you get a blue outline. To change that, I'm going to use the focus pseudo class on all the inputs, and then I can remove that outline, and I'll replace it with a box shadow. That gives it a little depth. And I'm going to go ahead and change the border as well. So as I click through these, you can see that shadow on email and zip, and city is still disabled, so I cannot give it focus. To make that more obvious, I can use the disabled pseudo class on the field set and change the opacity so that it looks grayed out when it's disabled. There is also an enabled pseudo class if I wanted to directly target all of the enabled items. Let's add some styling to these radio buttons. I'm going to use the check pseudo class to target the checked item, and use the sibling selector for label, which will enable me to style the label of the select item. I'm going to go ahead and change the font style to italic. So when I go through and click these, you can see that the label changes on each one to be italic. I can also use the invalid pseudo class to make it more obvious to the user that what they're typing in the text input is invalid, and I can set the border color to red, which you can see here will actually make the zip turn red because it's invalid to leave it blank because it is required. So I can also use the input valid opposite pseudo class to change the border color to be green, which will change the email field since it doesn't have that required attribute, so it's okay to be blank. And if I wanted to go ahead and differentiate those required fields, I could use the required pseudo class. And here I can actually use border width and make it just a little bit thicker. I should say that there's also an optional pseudo class if you needed to target all the optional items. So we've looked at how we can use some state pseudo classes to target specific interactions from the user, and hopefully we can use those to make it a little bit more obvious to the user what they need to change or what they need to do as they're going through filling out the form before they submit it. Now these last pseudo classes have to deal with the location of the element in the DOM hierarchy. Now here we're back to an unordered list of mostly links, and as we scroll down you can see I just took off some of the styling of the list, and then here is our first pseudo class. This is the first child. I am changing the background to this blue color. So you can see the first child, it's kind of a purplish color. The first child in the list element is going to be this purple, and this last one as well. So if I go ahead and comment these out and save it, then we can look at this next one. So we've got first child and last child, and then this is the nth child. And here I passed in the parameter of 2, which just means the second child. If I went ahead and put this back to 1, this would be the same thing as saying first child. So I'm going to go ahead and put it back to 2 because that makes more sense. And we can pass through more complex patterns to this nth child. Here's an example of 2n, and you can see that it's going to be all of the even indexes. So the indexes start with 1, egghead would be index 1, but the n counting actually starts with 0. So it would first pick the 0th element, but there isn't one in this list, so then it will apply to not 1 but 2, not 3 but 4, etc. And if we want to get the odd elements, then we can say 2n plus 1. That way it'll choose the first element, the third, and so forth. And you can get more complex with this. This pattern will actually pick the first 4 elements and apply the style to it. The reason again why it does that is if we pass in 0 for n, it would be -0 plus 4, which is the 4th element, and then it's -1 plus 4, which is the 3rd element, and so on. And then you can also do something like this, which would be everything except for the first 3 elements. So you can do some interesting stuff with the nth child. You can make some complex patterns. And there's some other pseudo classes that you might find helpful. There's the nth last child pseudo class, which is the same thing as nth child. It just counts from the bottom going up. This only child applies to every element that is an orphan. Then there's only of type, which will allow you to target a specific element type. So if you wanted to get a paragraph that was all alone, regardless of what other sibling nodes were around it, you could use this. If you wanted to get last of type, again, if you wanted to get the last paragraph in a section, you could use this one. And then you've got nth of type, and it has the same pattern that you can use for the nth child. And same thing with nth last of type. It does the same thing, but it's counting backwards up. So you can get really complex with some of these pseudo classes. In fact, some of them make it a little bit hard to read and maintain the code, so you're going to want to be careful with these. Just use them where they make sense. Pseudo element selectors are used for styling elements that aren't explicitly set in the DOM. And like pseudo classes, we use a colon to declare a pseudo element, but we use 2 colons to differentiate pseudo element selectors from pseudo class selectors. So probably the most useful are the before and after pseudo elements. So I've got a block quote here in the HTML, and if I wanted to put some quotes, double quotes before and after, I could use the before pseudo class or pseudo element to go ahead and change the content to be set to double quotes, which will make a double quote character appear before the rest of the content. And I can duplicate this and change it to an after, and that'll give me double quotes afterwards. We can also have some better formatting on our quotes with the helpful property called quotes. So if we use the block quote selector and set the quotes property to be a series of quotes here, I'm going to go ahead and just paste it in. And these are just strings that represent the curled double quotes. And here in the content in the before, I can change it to be open quote and change it to be close quote. And that will actually replace those quotes with those curled ones. The second pair of quotes actually applies to cases where you have nested quotes. Let's look at another useful example. So here I've got a nav with a unordered list of links, similar to what you might see in a footer of a website. And I'm going to go ahead and change some of the formatting of the list itself. I'll go ahead and start by getting rid of the bullets by changing the list style to none, and getting rid of that indent by changing the padding to 0. Then we can change the font family. I'm going to use Verdana, and that thing's huge, so let's change the font size to something a little bit smaller. And I'm going to align this to the center, which doesn't make too much sense right now, but once we go ahead and change the list item display, we're going to set that to inline block. Those will allow those things to all be on one line. And I'm going to style the link a little bit. I'll start by changing the color to something a little bit more subdued than that blue. And I'm going to change the decoration on the text to be none, so it gets rid of that underline. But right now, it's hard to actually tell where one link starts and the other one ends. So let's have a hover state to that, which will also make it seem a little bit more like a link. And that'll help with it by putting that underline back on the text decoration there. So if I hover over them, at least I can tell which is which. But to make it a little bit better, let's go ahead and put a separator in there. And this is where we'll use the pseudo element. We'll put an after. Got to use the double colon. We'll put an after on the list items, and we'll change the content to be just this vertical pipe. And I've got to change that to a class. And now you can see we've got a nice separator line, but let's change the margin a little bit to spread it out a little more evenly. And if you notice, that last one's got a line on it as well, which it doesn't need. So we'll use the nth child or the nth last child to start it after that first element. So we'll do n plus 2, and that'll get rid of that last one. So let's go ahead and uncomment out the next example. This is just an article with a paragraph of text inside, and we're going to use it to show off another pseudo element called first line. So if we use the p tag and do first line, we can actually change the color of just the first line of text without defining it in its own element. And we can change that to something, instead of fire brick, we could change it to green. And there's another pseudo element that we can use called first letter. And that would allow us to do something like a drop cap. So I'm going to go ahead and change the font size to be something bigger. And I'm going to set the float to left to get the text to go around it. And then let's play with the line height and some padding. And it probably also could use some font weight increase there, make it something a little bolder. And the last pseudo element example that we'll look at actually deals with form elements. So if we uncomment this, we've got an input that's of type email, and it has a placeholder, which is just a little bit of text that shows up when there is no text in there put in by the user. So we can style this placeholder using the placeholder pseudo element, and we'll change the font size to be a little smaller, and we can change the color. This will just make it a little bit lighter. At some point, you might be tempted to use some of these elements incorrectly, especially like before and after, because they allow you to insert content into the page from CSS. And it's almost always a bad idea to do this because the whole purpose of CSS is to separate out styling from the content, and we'd be using it to potentially put content from the styling back into the markup. So where it can be useful is in throwing in some non-essential content into the page, or really some decoration. And the same thing with the placeholder and the first line and even the first letter. These are all things that should be used for adding some styling, but not necessarily for changing the content or the nature of the content. CSS rule sets can have multiple selectors to reduce code repetition, and you can also combine selectors to be more specific with which elements to target. So we're going to look at some simple selector combinations in a fairly common example, a website navigation. Looking at the markup, you can see we have a bunch of list items or nav items here that have links. This one doesn't have a link, but it has a selected class, and this one's actually a button. So let's go ahead and start to style this up. Here I've got some already predefined stuff, but let's start with the site nav. We're going to go ahead and set the padding to 0 and 20 pixels because we're going to move it away from the edge a little bit. But we'll actually remove some of the styling of the list itself. So we'll turn the list style to none, and we'll set the padding on this to 0. We'll also change the font size to be something just a little bit smaller because we're actually going to change the text transform to be uppercase. And we'll also space out the letters a little bit. And we're going to uncomment out this, which is going to change the background color to this gradient, and we'll also change the font family to a sans serif. So now let's go ahead and style up the list items. We're going to set the display to inline block to make them go in a straight line. Now in both of these last ones, the site nav UL and the site nav LI, these are combined selectors. We could have just targeted the unordered list and the list items, but because we have prefaced it with the .siteNav with a space, that's going to be much more specific. So if we ever use another unordered list or a list item, which is very likely in this website, we don't have to worry about accidentally styling those items as well. This is very specific to just these list items and unordered list inside the site nav. And this space is a descendant selector. If I'm using just the space, that means that this is going to target any UL that is a descendant of the site nav class. If we look at the HTML, the site nav is here, and then you've got a UL right underneath it, and then you've got list items right inside of that. So if we look, this .siteNav space li, this is going to be any list item that falls within the .siteNav, even if it's not a direct descendant. To use direct descendant, we actually use the greater than symbol, and that would work here for the unordered list. But if I went ahead and added it to the list items, that would stop targeting them because these list items are not directly underneath the .siteNav. We could add it to the unordered list, but that is a little too specific for what we need because, to be honest, it's not likely we're going to have nested unordered lists in this nav. If we did and we needed to target those specifically, we could use that. So let's go ahead and keep styling. Let's change these nav items. We'll space them out a little bit here. Set the margin right to 30 pixels. And let's go ahead and style the links. Now they've got the blue color and that underline, so to be able to change that, I have to target them specifically. And we also have this selected nav item that doesn't have a link inside of it or an A tag inside of it. So let's add that selector and let's change the color to white. And I actually have a typo here. The nav item shouldn't be dash selected, it should be dot selected. Now we don't actually have the space here between these two classes, and that's because this is no longer a descendant selector. We're actually targeting the same element. If we look at the HTML, our selected item has nav item and selected as classes that are applied to this list item. And so to target that with the CSS, we can actually combine the two selectors without a space, and that means that this is one element that has two classes on it. So let's go ahead and get rid of that text decoration, that underline, and we'll set that to none. So the underline will go away on the links and also on the selected item. Not that it has it, but if it did, it would go away. And then let's change the padding on the bottom. We're going to do this because we're actually going to add an underline using a border, which gives us a little bit of control on the hover state. So to add that, let's go ahead and add a selector for the A hover. And then we also want this to be the styles for the actual selected item. So it'll have this underline if the item's the current selected item, like we're on that page, or if they hover over it. So border bottom, we'll set that to 1 pixel solid, and it'll pick up the white from the font color. If I hover over these, you can see the underline's there, and the contact has the underline, so we're good. And let's go ahead and style this login button. Now we'll use the descendant selector here. Button is actually inside of the .login button class. We're going to set the background to transparent, and we'll set the color to white as well. And let's set the border to 1 pixel solid. And we'll set the padding just to space out things a little bit inside that button. And let's style the typography to actually match the rest of the items. So we'll do the font size, the text transform to be uppercase, and let's do the letter spacing as well. And those have sharp corners, so let's adjust the border radius. And we want it to look like it's clickable. So let's change the cursor to pointer. Now let's also change the hover state on this. So we'll go ahead and change the background to be white. We'll just kind of flip the colors. And we'll change the color. Now we can't make it transparent, but we will try and match the closest color to the location, which is that greenish color, the teal. And we've got to also set the border color because it's going to be different than the font color. And I'm looking here, and this typography styling that we did, we actually did up above. And there's no reason to repeat ourselves. So let's go ahead and take that out. And let's figure out where we have this up above. Looks like it's in the unordered list. There are some styles here that don't apply to this item, but that's fine because we'll ignore those. But let's copy this selector. We'll use the comma. And what the comma does is it actually makes it so that I can apply the same rule set to two different selectors. So we used it down below, and it's a way to avoid having to repeat code. So anytime I want to change the font size now for these items, it's only in one place. So if I change it here, it will apply to all of the UL, but also to the button, which has different styling. I also don't have to worry about the padding 0 here because I actually set it to the correct padding down below, which will override this styling. So everything looks good, and we've looked at how we can combine selectors to be more specific, or we can actually add multiple selectors to save on repeating ourselves and making the code just a little bit easier to maintain. Let's look at the sibling selector, which is a less common CSS selector combinator. And for this example, we're going to style a navigation. This is an unordered list of radio buttons. And the benefit here is that even without CSS or JavaScript, this nav is pretty functional. It easily shows which item is selected. And this could be a good strategy for a single page app navigation. Looking at the markup, we have list items with a class of nav item, and they contain a checkbox input. And this one has a property of checked, so the page loads with this as the default selection. And then they have a corresponding label. On the end of the list, we have a login button. So let's go ahead and start styling this. If we look at the CSS, I have commented out some styles here. It adds a background with a linear gradient, styling the nav, just basically, and then styling the nav items. Also, I have commented out the styling for the login button. So now let's go ahead and style these nav items with these radio buttons. And we'll start by styling the label. And I want to make these look like they're clickable, so I'm going to change the cursor to pointer. And then let's add a 3-pixel padding on the bottom, which we'll use for an underline in the selected state. But these radio buttons are in the way. They're nice for functionality, but not for design. So on the radio button, I'm going to start by setting the pointer events to none. That'll make it so that if you click on it, nothing happens, because we're actually then going to set the position to absolute to get it out of the layout and not mess up the layout further. And then we're going to set the opacity to 0. And then we're going to go ahead and set nav item radio checked. Now we want to change the state of what happens when they're checked. So I want to put a border on the bottom, which will act like an underline. But if you can see here, this didn't do anything. And that's because the radio button's hidden. So I'm going to use this plus symbol, which is the sibling selector, so that when it's checked, the label should have an underline. Now that's useful when the sibling is right after the initial selector. But if you have, like in this instance, where I've got a span in between, you can see that the pricing doesn't get its underline. So if I change this from a plus symbol to a tilde, what that'll give me is a general sibling selector. It doesn't have to be right after. Now there's a word of caution here, is that order is important, because I cannot select a sibling that comes before the first half of the selector. Doesn't work that way. Cascading styles only work in one direction, so it has to be a sibling that follows after the initial element. And that's the sibling selector. And if you use it correctly, there's not a ton of use cases for it, but when you really need it, it comes in very handy. Selector specificity is one of the most useful and potentially the most complicated parts of CSS selectors. CSS is designed to have a cascading hierarchy of styles, so you can override styles as needed. And most of the time, the last style declared will override conflicting styles that have been declared before, but specificity can counteract that. If two selectors have conflicting rules, the selector with the higher specificity will win, but if they both have the same specificity, the last declared rule will win. So it's important to understand how specificity is calculated so that you'll be able to figure out which style will actually end up being applied in the browser. So these are two examples of selectors with different specificities. And the way that you calculate it is you figure out the parts that apply to different categories. So you've got the number of inline styles, and in this case, these are selectors that are part of external style sheets or embedded style sheets, so that doesn't really apply. So there'll be 0 in both these cases. But we can count the number of IDs. In this case, there's just site nav. So there's one ID and the number of classes, attributes, and pseudo classes. So if we look here, .nav item, that's one class. And then we can count the number of elements and pseudo elements. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is a bit more specific than it needs to be. We really don't need nav. We don't need list item. And we probably don't even need unordered list. So this one has a lower specificity. Here we've just got one class and one pseudo class, and then we've got 2 elements. So if these two were competing for the same styles, obviously the one with the higher specificity would outrank the lower one, even if this one appeared before this one. So if we're looking at the CSS here, we actually have it written out as an example, where here we have the color of white and a padding of 0, and with this same one we have a padding of 6. So we'd ideally want this padding of 6 to override the padding of 0, so that this blog would look more like a button with it separated out. But that's not happening here because the specificity is higher above. So if we took off some of these things, if we actually took off nav and we took off unordered list, and then we put site nav here, then we'll find that the specificity is the same. We're actually a little bit higher here, so we'll end up with the style applied correctly. Now, we have a color of white here, but the reason that that's not being applied is because in the HTML, we're actually using an inline style, which is just the style attribute on this element, and you write your styles in there, so there's no selector, it's just the rule set. And we're applying the color of orange to that. So even though this might have a higher specificity, the things that are currently being applied are inline style, so they trump everything. Now there's one way for a rule to override all the other rules regardless of specificity, and that's to use the keyword important at the end of the declaration before the semicolon, and you preface it with an exclamation mark. And what this is saying is, I don't care about specificity, I just want this rule to be applied this way. And it's a useful tool when you really need to use it, but it's highly recommended to avoid it at all costs, if at all possible. The reason being is it really throws a wrench into the cascading aspect of CSS. It makes it very difficult to try and figure out what's being applied and how it's being applied, and it makes it difficult for you to override that again in the future or further down in a different external style sheet if you need to. So yes, you can use important, but you probably shouldn't ever use it if you can avoid it. And if you want to see what is being overridden, you can always go ahead and inspect an element using the dev tools. You can do this in Chrome or in Firefox, and you can see what the declarations are on a specific element and what's being overwritten. It'll have a line crossed through it here. You can see that the orange is trumping the white, or the white is trumping the orange in this case because it has the important keyword. But like I said, it's probably best to avoid using the important keyword and also to avoid using inline styles if possible. Again, it's one of those things that make it hard to override things in the future or further down in the cascading chain. Ideally, you'll also try and keep the specificity low so it's easy to override if you ever need to. Oftentimes that means avoiding using ID if you can, stick to classes, and sometimes even avoiding using elements. And that's more of a maintenance thing to try and make it easier to maintain code if you need to change what element you're using. If you stick to just flat classes, then it makes it a lot easier to maintain the code. And there are a number of CSS ideologies that are associated with this, this idea of sticking with just flat classes for everything. So specificity is one of those things that if something's not working out right, if you're expecting something to be styled and it doesn't appear to be that way, oftentimes your specificity is mixed up and it's overriding in a way that you don't expect. So if you're not getting things to appear the way you want, go ahead and double check. Figure out all the things that are being applied to it and figure out if you've got things that are crossed out in your dev tools. Oftentimes that means that it's being overwritten in a different place that you might not expect.